They came from far and wide to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Their caliber, leaders. Their purpose, collaboration and development. And the designation of the meeting, special. The World Economic Forum's special meeting on global cooperation, growth and energy for development vis-à-vis the participation of Nigeria is our focus on Special Report.
I think it is, but first let me again join my fellow panelists.
Leaders of the free world came together in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia for the World Economic Forum special meeting on global cooperation, growth and energy for development. There were three main themes of the occasion, which pertain to catalyzing action on energy for development, as well as a compact for inclusive growth and reinvigoration of global collaboration.
It is slowly delivering, and we need to make it so that it delivers faster.
At a time when the International Monetary Fund latest World Economic Outlook showed optimism for the global economy because of silver lining economic data from some parts of the globe, and a widening income gap between the richest and poorest countries of the world for the first time in this century, requiring an encouragement to meeting the United Nations published Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, the World Economic Forum saw it fit to convene this special assembly.
So in a very polarized environment,
the gathering consists of participation from 60 countries around the world, leaders in all sectors and fields, to consist of sessions and themes of collaboration, growth and energy, with international organizations and multilateral development banks.
Have an election coming up, and it is
one of such sessions was the opening plenary titled A New Vision for Global Development, which had Nigeria participating with President Bola Tinubu in attendance, as well as President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, President of the World Economic Forum, Borja Brende, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, and the CEO of Financial Services Group, Lazard.
This is a phenomenal time for business and, frankly, for the state of humanity, the biotech revolution, the potential of the energy transition to reinvent the way that we obtain our energy. There are so many different revolutions happening at the same time, and there are perhaps early signs of some benefit from that. So, as an example, productivity growth in the United States over the past couple of years has started to pick up. It's too early to know whether that's related to these opportunities, but it's certainly possible. But to harness the benefit of those revolutions and the full potential requires a underlying structure that is not quite there. So businesses today basically are, in some sense, getting too much from policymakers and also getting too little. So let me try to explain that. In the too much category, businesses are now caught in the middle of many foreign policy and other geopolitical issues. Every major company in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere now requires the sort of geopolitical insight that used to be the domain only of oil and gas companies that were operating in complex environments. Now, pretty much every company needs that kind of capability. That's great for Lazard because we provide that kind of insight, but it's probably not so great for productivity because fundamentally you can't make an important business decision today without taking geopolitics fully into account, and that is different than 2 or 3 decades ago. During the Cold War, tension with Russia did not have any significant business impact because Russia was not that important to the global economy. That's not true with regard to where the geopolitical fractures are today. On the too little side, policymakers have not really fully stepped up to many of the core challenges that have already been identified, and the result of that is that companies are being asked to fill the void on social and other issues that policy hasn't fully fulfilled. So that is never going to end that well. That is a very, very, very imperfect third or fourth best relative to the structure that policymakers can put forward. So this is on everything from purely social issues to even the energy transition. I think there's been a lot of happy talk about what's involved in the energy transition. It is going to be expensive and it is going to be hard. Reasonable estimates are something like 10% of GDP per year through the next several decades invested in new sources of energy. And that's before you fully take into account the impact of artificial intelligence, at least given current chip design, maybe the chips will change, but given current chip design on additional demand for electricity. That is a very, very tall bill, and the thought that companies are going to be meeting the vast bulk of that bill is unrealistic. So there's both too much and too little, but I want to end again on a note of optimism because it's a very propitious time for a lot of these technologies. Let's just try to capture them as best as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a short follow-up question because we are all curious about the US economy. The US is still 25% of the global GDP with 5% of the global population. And there was expectations for a recession in the US, then there was soft landing, but now it seems like there is no landing, and there's also speculations that Fed even have to increase interest rate when we're expecting decrease in the interest rate in the summer. So we see that inflationary pressure is still there. So there are different ways of looking at this. We saw that JP Morgan is worried that there will be a very rough landing. What kind of landing will there be in the US economy if there is going to be a landing?
Sure, I'll answer that question and then I'll say I think it's probably partially the wrong question, but let me answer it first. My view, I'm pretty optimistic on this. I think the US economy has weathered the past several years extremely well. The consumer is still relatively strong. The labor market is strong. I mentioned that productivity has picked up. That means that unit labor cost growth is also contained. Those are all really good things for the fight against inflation. My own view is I think there's a temporary hiccup, just like there was at about this time last year, where inflation went sideways instead of continuing its downward path. I'm optimistic that the downward path will resume, so time will tell, and some humility is warranted because there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think the most likely path is one in which inflation continues to come down. But there are underlying problems in the US, and I would highlight the fiscal trajectory, where the deficit over the next 2 decades is projected to be 6 to 7% of GDP, and then polarization. The country is incredibly polarized. We obviously have an election coming up, and it is, I mean, as an example, I was confirmed as President Obama's budget director 15 years ago. At my confirmation hearing, Paul Ryan introduced me, and the Senate vote was 100-0. That would never happen today, and that was only 15 years ago. So in a very polarized environment, presidential elections are going to be very close. This will probably be determined by 1 million or 1.5 million people. And secondly, it's very hard to get serious policy done unless you control the White House, the House, and the Senate, and that only happens very infrequently.
So I think the question we're left with, how can such a dysfunctional political system deliver that kind of economic growth? Kristalina, I'll come to you now, but I think there is a good segue here because the global debt situation you have raised. We are close to 100% of GDP in global debt. And you are also saying we have to be more fiscally minded, but how to be that without going into austerity that will then kill growth again. I think we have like the highest debt level now since the Napoleonic Wars. That's not good news, is it?
Not at all. So what is necessary? First, to differentiate, there are countries that can carry the debt and it is not a danger to them unless, however, they are mindful, it may become a danger. And you mentioned the United States, deficit is high, there has to be thinking about fiscal path that brings it down. But there are countries where the debt burden is already far too high. And in these countries, we do need to offer a helping hand with that restructuring. There is the common framework that Saudi Arabia launched during their G20 presidency. It is slowly delivering, and we need to make it so that it delivers faster. However, I want to make on the issue of debt 2 points. Number one, how is that we can deal with it more sustainably? Of course, by having growth going up. We looked at the measures in the hands of policymakers. If we were to re-energize trade, if we were to get flow of capital to go where capital would bring highest returns, and if we were to build even stronger governance, within this decade, we can get 1.2% higher growth. In other words, we get to what we had historically. So that whole issue about fragmentation in the world economy is really serious. Trade and financial flows are the transmission lines of prosperity, and it would be a huge mistake to lose them. So focus on that. And my second point is taking from the President of Nigeria, reforms that are mindful of the vulnerable people in society. The Prime Minister of Egypt is here. Reforms pay off very, very well. So if we can have that leadership strength within countries to do the right thing and across countries to work together, the optimists in the room would say we are right. Optimism is well-grounded.
So, Mr. Prime Minister Ibrahim, you are also in a situation where you're caught between the G2, China and the US. And this is also a relationship that is quite volatile or fragile. And you're maneuvering this too on top of all the other challenges. Maybe you want to reflect on that for 2 minutes.
Well, it's not as complex because cumulatively, the investment in the United States remain number one in Malaysia. But of course, in the last few years, you see this growing investments and interests from China. How do we navigate it? By just saying, look, we welcome investments based on our rules and don't dictate and impose any conditions. We will not, for example, enter into any sort of a decision that is deemed to be provocative against one another. And I think so far we have managed, not easy, as a small emerging economy, we have to navigate very wisely. And we are fortunate against because there is somewhat an ASEAN consensus on this, though not in full because different strengths, but at least within the ASEAN mechanism, there has been this sort of a position that we maintain our neutrality, we engage with both, and we set our own priorities. Our problem with some of the big economies, of course, they dictate, they hector, they're quite condescending, and you have seen that in COP28 and some other forums, WTO, etc. But I think this is where I think to engage more broadly with Africa, with Latin America, and in the Middle East, particularly what the Kingdom has initiated, would be of immense help to us. We cannot do it alone, and we will have to then engage. Again, I said I would to conclude that we are fortunate because within ASEAN, though there may be some minor differences on foreign policy issues, but the focus and the engagement and the both bilateral and multilateral relationship is excellent. We do not have any issues having to work together as a team. And that's why ASEAN happens to be now one of the most cohesive force, a sub-regional force in the world. And we are now focusing more on trade investments, intra-trade investments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. President Tinubu, you have dealt with the domestic economic challenges, and in many ways Nigeria is a superpower in its region. But the region is looking also very challenging with Sahel, with the situation in Mali, Chad, also now in Niger. And I know the time is short, but is there any way we can see a stabilization in your surroundings in the years to come, or is it does it look very, very grim?
Thank you very much. We are encouraging the entire world to pay attention to SAE and the countries around us in ECOWAS. As the chairman of the ECOWAS, I've witnessed the big influence of Nigeria to discourage unconstitutional change of government. That is stabilizing. Equally, we have eased the sanctions. We need to trade with one another, not fight each other. It is very, very necessary and compulsory for us to engender growth, stability, and economic prosperity for our people. The rest of the world needs to look at fundamentals of the problem, not just ordinary geopolitically. It has to go to the root. As the world paid attention to the poverty level of SAE and the rest of ECOWAS, have they helped the infusion of capital and pay adequate attention to the exploitation and opportunities availed by the mineral resources that is available? Are we going to play only a big brother's role in a talk shop without necessary action? We just have to be involved in the exploitation, promotion, and prosperity of that region in order to see peace and stability and economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. So, President Kagame, we have this West-East challenge, but we also lately had this North-South. So a lot of the South is saying that there are double standards from the North.
Yes.
So how do you look at this, and is there a way for the North to regain the trust of the South? And someone in the North maybe would say the same, but I think it's mainly now South-North. So in 2 minutes, you can give us the full description and the blueprint for that.
Well, first of all, the divide is there. Let's not be vague about it. And we need to avoid it. We need to fight it. For example, if you look at it from the perspective of the global shocks that we talk about here and there, irrespective of where they have come from, all countries in the world are affected. Of course, some affected more than others. But that's fine. But that is a reminder that we need to, therefore, look at what has been talked about, the inclusiveness that we are talking about, and collaboration that brings different entities of the world together. So for that, we must be able to call out hypocrisy for whenever we see it. And it is there because we keep talking about North-South divide or other divides, but we don't find easily and quickly the solution to that. Yet we can. We know that we can do that. Therefore, and in this case, I'm going to argue for our continent, the continent of Africa, which, by the way, has the fastest growing middle class. And in fact, in not too distant future, it will be the only place that has a growing middle class. So how can you forget that this is a very important place in our world? Now, two things have to happen. The rest of the world have got to see that this is an important place to invest with and invest in. That's one. Second is for Africa itself to avoid any victim mentality and start raising ourselves to the level where we should be, and in fact where we are, that we are a very important geographical part of our world, and with a lot of resources. It's not just natural resources, it's the people at the same time. So I think being reasonable, seeing things for what they are, and then being upfront in fighting for the rights, therefore, maybe we shall be able to narrow the divide, but Africa has a very important place to be, an important role to play.
Thank you. Yep. So, Peter Orszag, you were mentioning that there are factors that can definitely increase productivity in this coming decade. You also mentioned what is happening in life sciences, AI. Are these factors strong enough to increase so much the productivity so we can see prosperity and avoid tepid growth in the coming decade? What are the additional policy measures that we need on a global level to avoid, to repeat, that the 20s will be the new 70s?
Sure. Well, I think the threat is not necessarily to growth, but rather to inequality and inclusion. Yep. There is major risk, for example, from the biotech revolution that the growing gap in life expectancy in the United States, for example, something like 2/3 of the American population has had flat to declining life expectancy over the past 25 years, while the very most advantaged socioeconomic groups have seen dramatic increases in life expectancy. It's not hard to imagine that being exacerbated by the new technology. So I think many of the points that have already been raised about the need for inclusive growth is the key part, as opposed to whether there'll be growth. And then one final point, which is everyone here is currently in a region that has a major advantage, as do the countries on this panel, the leaders of the countries on this panel, relative to many other places in the world, which has to do with demography. And we haven't touched upon that. The total fertility rate globally has fallen in half, and the share of the population over age 65 has doubled since 1950. Those areas that have, and by the way, don't allow yourself to fall into the trap of very low fertility rates and thinking that they can increase. I think the experience in China has shown that the move away from the one-child policy really hasn't worked. So it's a huge advantage to have a dynamic population, and that's one of the reasons why at least I'm excited to be here, and to be on this panel with many of the leaders of countries that have that dynamism, because that's a major advantage going forward.
Thank you. And I think everyone really appreciated that as our opening plenary at our special meeting here in Saudi Arabia. Give the panel another applause. Thank you.
The motive being a rekindling of momentum and development and economic convergence.
Another applause. Thank you.
Actionable items based on consensus will be one way to measure the impact of the World Economic Forum meeting further down the road, and whether that translates into the targets sought by the countries concerned. For Special Report, I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching.